So, Berto, a couple of months ago, I sent out a survey to all of the patrons and the people on YouTube and the people on Facebook, and I asked them to fill out this survey, asking them a bunch of questions about the podcast.
That's crazy. All 4 of them?
And so I thought we would go over those data. What do you say?
Sounds very intriguing.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and I love data.
I am also sort of a Star Trek fan, but my name is Humberto Castañeda, and I make humidifiers that don't require any water.
So this episode will just be about the survey, and if you're not into that kind of episode, I recommend you skip it. One of the findings of the survey actually found that some people will skip some episodes if they don't like the topic, and they really like it when I say up front what the episode is going to be about, so they don't get 20 minutes in and realize it's not an episode for them.
Can I say something rude about those kinds of people?
Sure.
No.
So this...
I love you guys.
Let's start with overall feedback. So I asked people how satisfied they were with the podcast on a scale from very dissatisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, somewhat satisfied, and very satisfied. What percentage do you think were very satisfied?
Very satisfied, 20%.
You're shooting low, right?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, 20%, like 80-20 rule, like most people will be satisfied, but not everyone's going to be very satisfied.
Well, 82% were very satisfied.
82%?
Yeah.
I mean, that's impressive, dude.
Which is the same rate from 2006. So I did a similar survey, a shorter survey 2 years ago, and end of 2006, and it was the same rate, 82%.
So it's 80-20 the other way.
So
wow.
Then 16% were somewhat satisfied, which is a similar rate as 2 years ago, and three people said they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, which equals 1%, less than 1%. And then one person, which is 0.3%. There were about 300 people who responded. So 1 out of 300 said they were somewhat dissatisfied.
Oh, wow. No one was very dissatisfied?
Nobody.
I guess, is it self-selecting? Like if you're very dissatisfied, you don't answer surveys?
Well, and if you're very dissatisfied, you stop listening. I mean,
yeah.
I'm a podcast listener.
Right.
And of all the podcasts I've listened to, I would say 3% of the podcasts I've tried, I've been satisfied with.
Uh-huh.
So
wow, that's low.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad podcasts out there. I mean, I hear about one, or I just Google, or I just in my podcast app, I'm just like, movie review podcast or something.
Dude, okay.
And if I stop listening to them and they send a survey to their people, I'm not going to. Right. So countless people have probably come our way and left, and therefore they never got a chance to fill out the survey.
I had a very touching experience over a Christmas break. I was at a party that I go to every year, and a good friend of mine who I see almost every year at this party, because he's the son of one of my mom's best friends, or my mom's best friend, actually. And we were at this party, and we're talking, and he's like, by the way, Berto, I am now full on like Psychology in Seattle fan. And I'm like, what? Really? He's like, yeah, I've been marathoning all your episodes. I'm like, what are you kidding me? He's like, yeah, so I listened to lots of podcasts, and Joe Rogan was my number one, but that's no longer true. You guys are my number one now.
Wow.
I was like, what the heck? And it was kind of weird because this is someone I've known forever, and all of a sudden they know more about me than I probably intended. So it was funny.
That's great.
So he's probably listening to this right now. Yeah. Mark, if you're out there, this one's for you, bud.
So some final feedback. I asked, so there's a lot of questions, but the final question I said, just, open-ended question, just whatever sort of feedback you have. And nearly every response was positive, actually. And the most common, so I read all the qualitative responses and coded them all. And the most common category was something along the lines that they love the show.
Nice.
55% of those who responded indicated some love for the podcast. For example, one respondent wrote, "I'm totally in love with this podcast."
Aw.
Another wrote, "I absolutely love you guys." Another respondent wrote, "I adore this podcast for so many reasons."
I'm twiddling. My heart is fluttering.
Another person wrote, "This podcast is an integral part of my life, and I depend on it to soothe, entertain, and teach me all sorts of things. I love you."
Wow.
Yeah, it's really great.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So I have to say, when I was going over the data, the negative responses really got to me. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Not got to me, but I was focusing on them quite a bit. And then as I actually started to analyze the data, I was like, actually, there's a lot of positive responses.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. And then the next thing that it affected me was I sort of had an idea that was true, but it's so rare when someone loves something that they actually will comment on.
Right.
And the most frequent comments that I read are comments on YouTube. Because that's a frequent thing that people will comment on. But the vast majority, and we'll get to this in the survey, of people who listen to the podcast, they're listening on their phone app.
Right.
There's no way to comment on your phone app. So you're listening in your car, and you shouldn't be commenting anyway in the car. Or you're doing chores and you pick up your phone. Like, what do you do? Like,
Right.
it's not an easy clickable thing. Whereas you're on YouTube, it's just right below. Boom, you just add something. And people on YouTube are, as I've talked about before, way more likely to be upsetting to me.
At least the ones that comment.
Yeah, and so that's what I mean. I mean,
Yeah.
commenters on YouTube, I should say. So, I mean, we get a lot of likes on YouTube.
And we get way more views than even likes. So clearly a lot of people are seeing it that are not even liking, let alone commenting.
Right. I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
I've never commented on YouTube. I've liked something maybe twice or something. And there are plenty of channels that I love. I don't even subscribe to those channels because I'm too lazy or something.
I like and comment constantly.
You do?
Yeah.
I understand.
But I'm not one of the abrasive bastards.
And the YouTube channel is only a small percentage of those who listen to our podcast anyway. So it's just great to do this survey and actually get like a real representative picture of what people think of the podcast. 27% said something along the lines of thank you. For example, someone wrote, "Thank you for my favorite podcast." Another said, "Thank you for all your hard work."
Wow.
The next category down, 14%, wrote about learning a lot from the podcast. One person said, "I have learned so much." Another wrote, "Great job. I have learned so much from you. Thank you."
When they say great job, do they mean the job that I hold in my outside career?
We'll get to that in a second. The next category is that they said something along the lines that the podcast has helped their life. And I have to say, these responses were the most touching to me, because it's one thing to entertain and learn. It's another thing. It's like, this podcast has affected my life in a positive way. And that's my mission in life, is to attempt through my work with my clients, through my work with my supervisees, my work with my students, work with the podcast listeners, is to try to make a positive contribution to the world. So I just want to read these because I think they're very heartwarming. "You've made a major contribution to the quality of my life."
Wow.
Pretty succinct there. "Thank you, guys. You've changed my life in a good way." Another person, "I donate $20 a month. I do so because I feel my world is deeper and lighter because of your podcast." Another person, "I love this podcast. It's helped me because it's helped me with my own issues a lot, and also helped me and my husband. The podcast has helped me through the worst of times." So this one is interesting because there is an interesting relationship that podcasters have with their audience, right? It's an intimate thing, particularly I think the way that we do it, right? It's not just lecturing, it's personal.
You mean because of the SSV?
The SSV as well. It's very touching in that way. And so it feels, and we'll get into that later, people have a relationship with us and feel like they're connected to us, which I've always wanted, primarily because I think that's great. And also because the podcasts that I love, that's how I feel about the podcasters in that situation. Another person, "I'm much more compassionate to myself and those around me." Another person, your podcast is such a gem. It has helped me a lot in my life and provided me guidance when I don't have a lot. I consider you one of the most influential people that has impacted me, although we have never met.
Jeez, man.
Yeah, it's a big deal, right? Which I can totally see, honestly. I mean, not to be braggy or something, but the stuff that we get into, you know?
We're bigger than the Beatles.
Well, the topics, right? And the mission and the themes of compassion, of normalization, of anger at oppressive societal notions, at connecting people, understanding.
By the nature of the topic of the podcast, it will inevitably touch on so many topics that are real life topics.
And I believe underrepresented sentiments
Yeah.
in media and even among clinicians, honestly. All right. So the next category is people saying don't change. So essentially, because the whole half of the survey was basically intimating like, would you like us to change this?
I see.
Do you like this? Would you like less of this? Would you like more of that? And a good percentage of people were just like, look, don't change anything.
Don't change it.
So one person says, keep up the good work. You are both wonderful humans.
Aw.
Another, I like your podcast the way it is.
So I was going to start doing a robot voice from now on.
The next group of respondents, 9% indicated some love or like for me. The next one, 9% of people commented on my compassion and responsiveness. Aww. Another person, or 9% of people also indicated that this is their favorite podcast. And the next 8% talked about you in terms of your vulnerability and your humor. For example, one person wrote, I also appreciate Humberto's authenticity, self-disclosure, and humor.
Ah.
So
it's working.
Someone apparently understands your jokes.
One person out there.
Another person wrote, you are doing much appreciated work, and the level of self-analysis and openness Kirk and Humberto do is astounding. Thank you. Another 8% indicated, so some people indicated more than one sentiment. That's why this adds up to more than 100%. 8% indicated appreciation for humor and entertainment. One person said, you guys make psychology fun. The Kirk Humberto episodes are the best. Thank you for making me laugh and learn. Keep at it. I'll be listening. And she actually signed her name Genevieve. So she was, I think, the only person who just said, I don't mind if you have my name. And 8% indicated that the podcast has helped their career.
Wow.
And this was another big one for me because, I guess secondary to making a positive difference in the world is to help fellow clinicians out there.
Yeah, help them professionally.
Yeah. So.
Oh, but they probably mean like other people that are also in the business of humidifiers.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, they come here for humidifier talk, and that's what they get. One person wrote, as corny as it sounds, I have both laughed and cried listening to this pod. I have also learned skills as a therapist while literally driving to my job. Another person said, love your podcast. It was very influential in my decision to go back to grad school.
Wow.
This provides such an amazing resource and is really making us all better therapists in the long run. Another one here. This podcast has changed the direction of my vocational journey. I really cannot tell you how much it has meant to me and how you, Kirk, have put words to many things in my head. I'm indebted to you and hope to continue to learn from you for many years.
Incredible.
So that's a really big deal. When I started the podcast, I think that was perhaps my prime directive was a resource for therapists.
I remember that's how you talked about it.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, because you said, hey, I'm thinking of starting this thing. You didn't approach it as like, hey, I'm doing a thing just for the hell of it. And like, I just want it to be light and fun. You specifically said like, this is part of my my profession, and I think it'll have an impact for the field, and blah 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 blah, in so many words. But of course, you did want it to be somewhat entertaining, so you tried to remember to hire that funny guy, and since he wasn't available, you got me.
Humberto's joking. Humberto was the first person I asked, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no.
Oh, it was
Bob was the first person I asked because he's another therapist.
Oh, right.
And he didn't want to do it, I think because he was afraid. And then actually, I think what he said was, I don't think I have anything to say or something. And then I asked you, or maybe I thought about Bob and you. Anyway, the point is
you exhausted your Rolodex. And
the next group was people just commenting on Humberto in general. For example, one person wrote, Humberto is my favorite co-host. I enjoy his sense of humor and vulnerability.
Aww.
Another wrote, you are doing so much appreciated work, and the level of self-analysis and openness Kirk and Humberto do is astounding. I think I already read that.
Yeah, you read that one. But that's okay. You can read that one all day long.
Yeah. And the last category of open-ended responses were positive about the variety and volume of podcasts. For example, one person wrote, I really appreciate the range of topics and incredible depth that you all provide. Another wrote, the consistency and sheer volume of enjoyable and educating episodes that keep coming out are just unbelievable. That's actually one thing that a lot of people will say if they don't know the podcast. They'll be like, oh, so how often, if they find out I do a podcast,
right.
Like, so how many episodes, how often do you release episodes? I'm like 3 a week.
Yeah.
And they're like, what?
Right. No, it's hilarious because I've recently come to realize how little I've talked about the podcast to people in my circles throughout the years. And so there's people I've known all this time, or at least in the last few years, and I'll be having a conversation and it'll just kind of casually come up and I'm like, oh yeah, I do a podcast. Like, oh, and it's almost, like when someone's like, I'm picking up ceramics or something, like, oh, that's cute. Like
I have a little hobby that
right. And I sort of talk about it like that, but they're like, oh, like when did that start? It's like, oh, actually it's been 10 years. They're like, wait, what? And then they're like, oh, so you must have a lot of episodes. I'm like, yeah, we have like over 800 or something. Like, they're like, wait, what? And then it's this switch over to like, what the hell? Like, you never talk about this.
Yeah, I don't talk about it either.
Yeah.
I consider it to be slightly, of course, I want everyone to listen if they want to listen, but there's something kind of scary about people close to me listening.
Yeah.
It's one. Two, it's weird, like at Antioch, there are a lot of students and staff and colleagues and everything. And one, of everyone I pass in the hallway, or of every student I talk to, I don't know if they're just a student that barely knows me, or they've listened to all 800 plus episodes and know very many things about me.
That's a good point.
and then sometimes they'll just be like, oh, and by the way, I've listened to all your episodes, and I'll just be like, it'll, because it really shifts the relationship at that point. And so there's that. And then I instantly start thinking, did I say anything stupid recently that would be,
Well, it's like when we finally met fans for the first time last year, like a lot of them. And it was that moment of, I remember talking to a few of them. They're like, yeah, I've listened to hundreds of it. And I'm just like realizing, oh my God, you've heard a lot more about me than I realized someone would hear about me,
Yeah. I mean, we always knew intellectually that those people were out there. And of course, people would email in and say certain things, but it was another thing entirely to meet them face to face. That was,
I had a crazy thing happen to me last week after our podcast. So I went home and it was late because we did like 5 hours of podcasting. It was ridiculous. And I was super tired and hungry, and everything closes around where I live like early, right? So I realized, oh, this place looks open and they have good food and they have a bar. So I thought, oh, maybe the bar's still serving or something. So I went in and I sit at the bar. There's 2 women there. One is the bartender. The other one is a client, or what do you call these people?
Patron?
A patron, yes. And I sit down and I realize, and I ask, hey, are you guys still serving food? And the bartender says, no. And I realize it's too late for me to back out. So I'm like, all right, I'll just order a drink. So I start talking to the gal that's sitting there. And we had like a crazy conversation about like American Psycho and movies and all these things. And the conversation started quite cordial. And towards the end of the conversation, it was a full-on debate about movies and people and intentions and crazy stuff. And it got sort of heated, not like bad heated, just like I was defending, you know me, I don't back down from a debate. And this person didn't either. So we were full on debating. But sort of in the middle of our conversation, it came up that I did a podcast and she asked what it was and stuff like that. Well, at the end of this long, exhausting debate, it was time for me to go home. And I sort of was feeling like we were ending it on a conflicted note because like we argued a lot. And when you just meet someone and like you spend like an hour just heavily arguing. But as I'm walking out, she's like, "What's the name of that podcast again?" And I'm like, "Psychology in Seattle." So I think she might listen.
Ooh.
So if you're out there and you're listening,
you're wrong.
You're wrong about everything, but that was a fun debate.
Okay, so the other reason why I don't like talking about my podcast to acquaintances is it feels I'm mortified to think that they would think I'm like wanting them to listen. Like, and I've been this way from the beginning. I remember when we first started the podcast when no one was listening, like not a single human being was listening to the podcast. I remember people would give advice like, well, tell your friends.
Right.
And I was like, if my podcast depends on my friends listening, then I'm doomed. You know what I mean? Right. I need people to organically listen.
I gotta be honest. I also was glad that we weren't doing that because it helped me be more open.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm the kind of person, as you know, that I probably would have gone down the similar route, but it certainly was more liberating to know that no one was listening because I could say anything.
Yeah.
And then over time, I just kind of got into that mode of like, I can be open. I can talk about my life and my experiences and it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
And then when I finally had people that did, and then I was like, oh, that ship has sailed.
Yeah. It is kind of a weird thing because it's like, of course you want people around you to listen if they want to, but at the same time, it does bring home certain consequences, shall we say. So I'll get to some negative things in a bit, but I'm at the point in the report where there's some more positive things. I asked people what their favorite part of the podcast was, and what do you think the number one thing was that was? And this was an open-ended question too.
Tough or bluff?
No,
so we don't do many tough or bluffs these days.
No, that is not their mode. In fact, we'll get to that later.
Okay, the where we analyze movies or music.
No. Actually, we'll get into that later too.
Well, okay, your deep dives.
Yes,
the deep
exactly.
dives. Yeah.
So 27% of respondents indicated that the deep dive episodes were their favorite part of the podcast.
That makes sense.
For example, one respondent wrote, "Deep dives are my favorite. Kirk, you are the best source for providing a depth of psychological knowledge and content in super accessible medium and format. I so appreciate it." So that's interesting which is good because you
put so much effort into
right.
that.
Probably half the time I spend on this podcast is on those deep dives. So that's great. And it makes total sense. Like, do you listen to Dan Harmon? Dan Harmon?
Yeah.
No. Dan Harlan. Wait, the hardcore history guy.
Oh. Isn't Dan Harmon the Rick and Morty guy?
Yeah, he's the guy who made Community.
Yeah.
Harlan, I think is anyway.
No, you've told me about hardcore history.
So hardcore history is this podcast where he does deep dives only, and he only releases like on average maybe one episode every 6 months.
Wow.
And when they come out,
they're hardcore.
they're events. Yeah. You know what I mean? They're like 7-hour episodes on like Julius Caesar
that he researched for 6 months.
Right. And recorded it for 6 months, So I get that people like deep dives. And because people have become patrons of the podcast over the past few years, it's given me that freedom to actually cut back on work and I feel like I spend half my waking hours on deep dives now. Right. Like right now I'm working on an attachment one, and I, spend probably half my day on those kinds of things because I can cut back on my work and actually spend the time on that. The next category of their favorite aspect of the podcast was that it's educational. About 14% wrote that they learned something from the podcast. And the next one is that they like our chemistry, the chemistry between Kirk and Humberto.
Nice.
And those responses we'll discuss later because there's a section on you. The next one is that they love how entertaining it is. For example, they wrote, "It's educational, interesting, and entertaining. I like everything about the podcast." Another wrote, "Kirk's interaction with co-hosts, especially Humberto, is entertaining." Another person wrote, it can just be funny as hell," they said. The next category
it's funny. Why do people assume hell would be so funny?
or shit.
Yeah.
Or fuck.
Yeah.
The next category is comments on me, which I'll get into later, or we already did. The other is variety of topics, as we talked about before. So they say, "I enjoy the range of topics, clinical stuff, current events, movie reviews, letters. It's never too heavy, but is always very thorough." Another person wrote, "The mixture of pop culture and clinical topics works well." Another person wrote, It's great to get in-depth info about psychological disorders, treatments, theories, etc., but also fun stuff like movies and email responses." Another person wrote, "The wide variety of topics is my favorite part of the podcast. It almost never gets dull or repetitive." So that's actually great feedback for me.
That is great, yeah.
Because there are so many things that because I always decide what we're going to do the podcast about.
Yep.
And there are so many things to do.
Yeah.
And over the years, I feel like the listeners have taught me what they respond to and what they like. And there's sort of a Venn diagram with what I want to do, because there are probably a lot of things the listeners want me to do that I'm like, eh. Like a lot of people are asking me to comment a lot more on like serial killers and this kind of thing. And I feel like we've done that enough. And I feel like other podcasts do it pretty well. And maybe we'll do it occasionally.
Sure.
But there's something about that content that just feels sensationalized or something.
Yeah, it's definitely, and it's way less applicable to our lives, you know?
Yeah, and almost depressing in some way, you know?
Very much so.
So
It's still, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's interesting. We've done some of them. We're not against doing more.
we'll probably do more.
Yeah.
And honestly, we'd probably get a lot more hits if I did them. Like the most popular YouTube episode by far is the one I did on the guy who shot up the UCSB. Anyway, anyway, the point is that people really, their favorite part of the podcast is this mix between, I'll do 10 hours on suicide, and there's not a joke in there, obviously. And it took me 3 months to research that.
Because that would be career suicide.
Yeah. And it's well researched, it's scientific, it's clinical, it's 10 hours of, very clinical discussions. And then next episode, we're laughing about the new Star Wars movie or something, you know what I mean? And it's always kind of a guess as to like, well, I hope this is good content.
Yeah.
And so it's great to get that feedback.
That is great.
The next group, their favorite part of the podcast is Humberto himself. 10% said their favorite part of the podcast is Humberto.
I did send out some incentives ahead of time for the respondents to think about it.
Or you filled it out 10 times.
I filled it out.
The next is my knowledge and teaching style. The next is my empathy and non-judgment. And the next is the topics, which I guess is similar to the variety of topics. But a lot of people said the favorite part of the podcast is definitely the topics covered. Even when they are not directly psychologically related, they are informative and fun.
Nice.
So again, that's great feedback to get. Least favorite part of the podcast, what do you think?
Least favorite?
Yeah. What do you think the most common response was to that?
Oh, that's puzzling. Let's see. The least favorite might be...
let's take a break.
I know what
Let's
it
take
is.
a break. When we get
Okay.
back, we'll continue the conversation. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. If you haven't already become a patron, do so now. Go to patreon.com because that is what gives us the wind beneath our wings. So, Berto, what do you think is the most common response to when I asked survey respondents what their least favorite part of the podcast was?
Based on prior comments and things like that, I'd say when we start on one thing and we veer wildly off topic.
So that is number 6 or tied for 4 or 5. The most common response was no response.
Oh.
Which is actually so a third of people just didn't even respond.
Well, that's good.
So 100 people-ish.
I would have never guessed that one.
Out of 300 just just didn't respond at all. Because
Yeah.
presumably because they couldn't think of anything. They answered the question just before, they answered the question just after,
Right.
but not this one. The second response was that nothing. They didn't have anything.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, who are these people?
That was another
These are
third.
like the nicest listeners.
I know they are. Like, for instance, one person said, "As of now, this is my idea of the perfect psychology podcast."
Oh.
That's quite a statement. That I don't know if you want to encourage us in that way, but
Esto me toca el corazón.
another person wrote, "I have nothing bad to say about the podcast. I just wish there was an episode every day."
Whoa.
Whoa. Another person wrote, "Nothing really. Some episodes do not interest me as much, but not a good reason to say the podcast is bad. This is my favorite podcast!" So 2/3 of people either didn't respond or just said, no, I can't really think of anything.
Should I start doing more special effects like the dingo and the baby?
I thought about having drops, like getting a
little soundboard.
a little soundboard, just with some simple ones, just like like a little rim shot. What's funny about the quote unquote rim shot is there's no rim shot in the rim shot.
Right, that's true.
It's a snare. Well, it's a snare hi-hat.
Yeah.
I think. Anyway, so the next thing was, so you got you got 1/3 that says no response. You got another third that says nothing, all good, and you have 5% that say political talk.
Oh yeah, okay, I could see that because that's so touchy, I guess.
So one respondent wrote, "My least favorite moments during the podcast are times when the conversation and or topic becomes blatantly politically driven."
Those must be Trump supporters that said that.
Actually, I have those data, and that's not, we'll get to that later, but
I kid.
But actually, I think all these responses were from liberals.
Okay.
Another person wrote, "Although the political discussions can be interesting, at times it can become divisive and reinforce the divisive mindset that seems to be present in society." Another person wrote, "When the podcast starts to get political, I just turn it off."
Oh, wow.
So we'll get more into the politics later,
Interesting.
but because I actually asked more specific questions about that. But let's move on. The next least favorite part of the podcast, which ties for political talk with 5% of people mentioning, is movie talk.
What? They don't like the movies?
So we'll get into this later, but like there's a small percentage, 5%, who really just don't like it when we talk about movies or TV shows.
Okay.
But there's more than that who love it.
Who love it, okay.
So the thing I say about this is that we don't do it very often, really. And when we do, again, the episode is clearly labeled.
Yeah.
So you can skip that one. No big deal. Some people, we'll get into it later too, but some people don't like the movie talk because they don't watch movies. It's funny to think about you and me, but given how many movies and TV shows we're at least aware of,
Yeah.
that some people just never go to the movies.
They just don't care. Yeah.
They don't watch movies at home.
Yeah.
They just don't care. There are people adults, who have never seen Star Wars, for example.
Right.
And they're just not interested. And that's fine, but you could imagine if
it's not fine, but sure.
if we did an episode or a series of episodes about a movie, for example, they would be like, I have no interest in listening.
Right.
Or they really want us to go into clinical things because some people are solely interested in clinical things, which is fine. And I think given the feedback from the survey, I'll kind of adjust slightly a little bit, maybe a little bit more clinical, but
like what's the psychological diagnoses about Raylo supporters?
Exactly. Which actually, maybe they would like that. But so, for example, they wrote, "I sometimes feel left out when you guys talk about movies I didn't watch." Another person said, I'm not into movie reviews, but I can deal with it." Another person wrote that they're the most frivolous content like TV shows. Another person wrote, "I haven't enjoyed the movie reviews, but there's enough content produced that I simply skip over episodes I'm not into. It's not a big deal."
I'm going to start a spin-off show on YouTube, just deep dives on movies.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad
all
idea.
our patrons.
It's not a bad idea. The next were 4% said they had trouble with access to the archive. Because, so, and we'll get into this. So maybe we should just kind of elaborate on this. The situation right now, the way I would describe it in early 2019 is the tech industry has essentially ignored podcasting.
Yeah.
There are simple solutions to so many problems for podcasters and podcast listeners that are simply not being looked at by anyone.
Yeah.
And it is bizarre.
Right.
It'll change. I'm convinced that if capitalism works the way that it will, in 20 years, it will be 100 times more convenient, podcasting or whatever form that kind of situation is going to be in the future. We're in a transition zone right now where there are some solutions emerging, but no quintessential, all-encompassing, solution. The analogy that I have to it is particularly in the late 90s, maybe early aughts, maybe throughout the aughts, if you wanted to design your own website, it was kind of a hassle.
Oh, totally.
You had to know someone who knew HTML or some other software that translated into HTML.
If you rewind enough, you had to set up your own server.
Right. You had to house, and mid aughts, I think a lot of people, their website was literally on their
computer,
on their desktop computer at home. You would hear about some small website crashing because someone had didn't have enough bandwidth at their home computer. So now, with Squarespace and Wix and other products like that, making a website is so easy. Yeah. It's like easier than designing your Facebook page. I mean, sometimes when I'm trying to design my Facebook page or I'm trying to change, it's hard. Squarespace, because I use that all the time, so easy. So right now we're in the early aughts when it comes to podcasting, where the marketers have not caught up to the demand.
Well, so I was thinking about this a lot recently because you've been talking about this to me, and my analysis is there's no YouTube for podcasts,
right?
But companies I say products like YouTube are in a perfect position to try to solve it, right? Because people that upload to YouTube, they have good tooling, they have good metrics, statistics, everyone can comment on your YouTube videos, and you can share them easily, right? So people that have YouTube channels, they generally get good tools so that they can share that content broadly and all these things. But with podcasts, of course, we upload to YouTube, but it's not known as a podcasting hub. Right. So, and you can't listen to YouTube channels the same way on iTunes or something like that,
Right.
And but it could work similarly, where I upload my episodes to this thing that keeps track of all of them. It has commenting enabled on all of them. It's got all the same kind of facilities, and YouTube supports the idea of premium content too. So, right. Anyways, that's the point. Video evolved way past where audio went.
And I've been on that journey with YouTube because I started uploading to YouTube, 8 or 9 years ago. Yeah. And at the beginning, YouTube did not allow videos for regular people that were over 10 or 20 minutes.
Right.
So I had to break up all their episodes into parts, which was a massive pain in the ass.
It was annoying, yeah. I remember watching or hearing them and having to click.
So what I did is I went with Vimeo, because Vimeo actually allowed longer episodes. Right. And then when YouTube changed, then I went back to YouTube. And so it's a similar thing. It's demand and technology and investment and noticing customer needs and rolling out new functions. Podcasting is still, in my estimation, basically in the dark ages. So what that results in is that a lot of people who listen to or everyone who listens to the podcast on their phone only has easy access to the most recent episodes, probably in the last year and a half. Because if you think, because typically the max is 300 episodes.
Yeah.
Even though some podcasts that I know of have more than 300 episodes on their podcast, and it's I don't get how that works.
Through the same apps?
I think so, but anyway.
Okay.
The point is that so what that means is like 300 episodes. Well, if you do 3 a week, that's about 150 episodes a year.
Yeah.
So it only goes back 2 years. We've been making episodes for 10 years.
Yeah.
So, and some of the best or some of the most sought out episodes, particularly by some individuals, are before that time.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for people. Plus Patreon, the app, it's because a lot of people listen on the Patreon app too. And that app is not set up for archive episodes.
I see.
It's set up to watch the most recent few.
I see.
People have to scroll. I mean, people that wrote in and they'll be like, yeah, I scrolled down. It took me like 35 minutes to scroll down.
Oh.
Yeah, because Patreon it's not set up for that.
Oh my God.
And that's what I'm talking about. Like, how are we living in that world where someone can't just type in the word and instantly have that episode popped up? The website is the best place to go, by the way, people, which we'll get into later. But anyway, so when asked their least favorite part of the podcast, about 4% were like saying things like, at times it's difficult to access the older feeds. There are some topics I want to search for, but haven't as it's a hassle. I also hate when the password changes, but understand the need for it.
Yeah.
Another person wrote, I wish there was a better search button for finding podcast shows or topics, especially old podcasts that don't load on the Apple Podcast app anymore.
Yeah.
So Humberto and I are working on a solution to this, where the solution at this point, which will likely not be needed in the future, is a dedicated app just to this podcast. So we're looking into options for that and functionality. I polled everyone on Facebook and on Patreon, and about 75 to 80% of people. So I asked the question, would you be interested in an app?
I see.
Even if it didn't have the Patreon episodes, because at that point I was looking at an app that didn't allow premium content. I was just like, would you still be interested in it? And like 75, 80% of people are like, yeah, that sounds great, because they'd have access to 800 plus episodes.
Right.
So in one spot, every episode would be on their phone.
Right. So
one solution that I'm thinking about moving forward, and listeners out there, let me know what you think, and Berto, let me know what you think, is it's probable that whatever app we find will not support premium content, meaning that there's a paywall or a password protected zone that has episodes beyond that wall, right?
Uh-huh.
Is that your understanding?
Well, depending on which solution we go with, that could be the case. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking that we would do a very simple, elegant solution. Is that there'd be one feed that would be on this app that would have every episode. That would be all the free episodes. Mm-hmm. Then there would be another place that would only have those premium episodes and would have no other episodes. Right. So that way you could, because we don't have 300 plus premium episodes. There's 100 or something. So we have a lot of room there to grow. And it would be a place where you could find those critical episodes that people are looking for. A lot of people are looking for that particular episode. And so it's like, for in all likelihood, it's in that premium zone. The problem with that is that patrons would this is a non-premium episode, has ads in it,
Yeah.
And so the patrons would have to sit through ads, or, would have to fast forward through ads is a better way of putting it. What do you think about that, Berto?
Yeah, that seems like unideal, but it could be a short-term kind of workaround so that people can access all of them. My hope is we can land on a situation where if you're a patron, you don't have to deal with the ads, but get access to all of it.
So the app might have that functionality?
I think so.
Okay. So let's shoot for that.
Yeah.
So more on that as time comes. And the next category, 4% of people said what you said, Berto, which is casual chit chat is the category I have.
I see.
They didn't like that. So one person wrote, sometimes I feel like the casual chit-chat goes on longer than I'd like, but that's a very minor thing, and for the most part, it gives the podcast personality. Another person wrote, it can get rambly at times. I love tangential learning, but the rambles can get a little long, which I think takes away from the topic at hand and makes it a bit get to the point frustrating occasionally. Unless it's ranty, then I like it. By the way, I love the podcast.
This reminds me of a story about the grass.
Another person wrote, I don't care much for the episodes that seem like it's just Kirk and Humberto hanging out. So I'm trying to think of episodes where it's like that.
I mean, you always hang out with me. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But I mean, seriously, so it is hard to distinguish. Some of them are maybe more random, right? Like some of them you have a more directed topic at hand.
Well, honestly, I think what this is referring to are much older episodes. Because if people are going back into the archive, and sometimes I'll post reruns.
Okay.
About half the episodes 4 years ago were you, me, and Mandy, or just you and me, just you and me hanging out, doing Tougher Bluffs.
I guess so. But what's weird is the way I remember it, and it's probably just because it's all blurred together now, that we used to do a lot more episodes where you would have these sections, like, okay, now we're going to talk about this topic, and you'd like read some of the literature, and then you'd ask me questions, and then we'd go to the next. Like they seemed a lot more structured.
Right.
But I don't know.
Right. So I personally think that we don't babble that much, and especially when you compare us to other podcasts. I mean, there are podcasts that I semi-like, and I'm just like, I don't want to hear about what you had for breakfast. It's just not interesting to me.
I think that I rarely sit there and just sort of say word after word with potentially little destination or words, and rarely.
I had ravioli for breakfast, actually. But just to go over all the responses, so the next group of responses were like 5 or less people said it. Heated debates.
They don't like the heated debates?
I hate to say this, but yeah, they don't like it.
Oh.
I hate to say this, but 5 people said they didn't like you.
In heated debates?
No, they didn't like you at all.
Oh, they just didn't like me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Their least favorite part of the podcast was you.
All right. Well, I'm surprised it's only 5.
Another 5 people said they didn't like it when I dismiss you.
Oh, so that's the protectors of the Humberto.
Yeah. We've talked about this before because people have written in, or at least one person wrote in or something. And it's absolutely true. I recognize it. There's a number of different excuses I can come up with as to why I would dismiss Humberto. It doesn't make it right, but
I feel like this is such an old problem that happened a few times and then you correct it and it hasn't really happened.
Well, that's nice to hear. But let me give some excuses. So it's hard for listeners to see this, but when Humberto and I sit down to record, it's at my house. So sometimes I'm worrying about my cat. I'm worrying about my dog. So, those can be distractions on my mind, meaning that Humberto doesn't have to worry about those things. Right. I'm recording it. I'm monitoring. I'm my own producer, I'm my own timekeeper. I have my computer screen is a giant computer screen that Humberto can attest to. I mean, do you know anyone who has a computer screen bigger than this one?
Mine's bigger.
Oh, it is.
But that's because I'm ridiculous.
And so I'm recording it. Sometimes I lose audio, and so I have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I have notes in front of me. I have a timer. During the breaks, I have to figure out what we're going to say when we're coming out of the break. I have to figure out how to introduce topics. I have to figure out how to keep us on topic. I have to figure out how to keep the arc. Like right now, we're at the 50-minute mark.
Right.
And I feel like we're going a little long.
Yeah, I'm falling asleep over here.
Whereas you, Berto, all you have to do is be in the moment.
That's right.
So you just react, which is great. But I have so many other things in my mind other than listen to Humberto or value Humberto's opinion or something. And sometimes when something is happening that, for example, it's not always this situation, but Humberto and I will be in a debate about something that will be interesting to me.
Or heated.
Which under normal circumstances, if we weren't recording, I would just yes and that or no but that until it just petered out. But I'm thinking about the listeners. I'm thinking about the time. I'm thinking about your time because you got to go home at some point. And so sometimes I'm trying to end a conversation. I'm trying to end a debate or a line of thinking. And I will not even be listening to what you're saying because I'm paying attention to some other aspect of the production of the podcast. Right. And I just look at you and I go, anyway, let's move on. Right. And to the listeners, I'm guessing it's just like, my God, Kirk just completely... completely.
I mean, I do notice those, but to me, I know that's like, let's end this segment.
But imagine if you're a listener, right? It would look like I'm just not listening or I'm just blowing you off, and that's not my intention. Sure. I will also say there are times when I'm literally angry at you, or hurt by you or something, and I retaliate by dismissing you. You know what I mean?
Okay, that I haven't noticed, because when we've been in a heated debate, I feel like at most whatever happens is like you rein it back in by saying like we've gone way off topic or I don't know. Like,
well, I'm glad you don't notice it. I notice it. I notice I'm angry or hurt, and
I mean, I've noticed you're angry or hurt, but I just haven't noticed you like dismissing me as a result.
Oh,
like it's more like there's been a few times where I guess I've seen like, okay, this really made Kirk uncomfortable, and I see that he's moving away from this topic.
Right.
But
which to listeners could appear as if I'm dismissing.
No, it could not.
Yeah. Because it's rare when we get going down a road like that.
Yeah.
The style of conversation that you like when you're talking about the woman at the bar.
Right.
I can totally picture that conversation in my mind. There's a certain type of person who, when they engage with you, it will never stop.
Yeah.
Because there are counterpoints to counterpoints to counterpoints to counterpoints to counterpoints, and there's never a point where you and Humberto say, well, maybe you're right, or well, let's agree to disagree. Like, you never do that. Right. You just keep counterpointing. It's just this rolling counterpoint, which is fine and great.
Well, it's a branching sequence too, because I'm trying to make a point. This person might veer off, so I follow down that rabbit hole, but know that I need to get back to this point.
Right, exactly. And, it's a enjoyable experience, for the most part. But for me, I'm in your direction, but I'm not as much like that. Like, I don't enjoy it I don't revel in it as much.
You pull the plug sooner.
Yeah, and so sometimes I'm just like, I guess let's move on. You know what I mean? Like, I don't, and I'm not graceful in terms of having a way of, like I've thought about, I should probably say something like, well, Berto, I totally get what you're saying. We're running out of time. Yeah. I apologize. Let's move forward. I think if I said something like that, it would
seem less disruptive or something.
The other thing that I hope the listeners are realizing now, given your response, you're just like, I don't know. I don't feel like you do that anymore. Is that Humberto and I off microphone and to a lesser extent on microphone, we argue all the time and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Like the amount of times we've disrespected each other in a conversation, it's like people get uncomfortable with it, but to us, it's just talking.
Yeah.
That's
right.
So I think, some people get worried. Having said that, I think you're nice about your response to me now. I think it is a problem that I've done, and I've tried, and I'll probably make a mistake again, but it's on my mind, believe me. It always has been on my mind.
I guess ultimately what I conclude with from my perspective is we've done how many hours of talking? So, I mean, I've gotten in more fights with other friends that I don't podcast with, right? So like, if a few times you were rude or whatever, it's like, all right. And I'm sure I said some shitty things many times. Like, okay.
And that's what I said, just to get real, about you years ago when we got, because we've been friends for, since
12,
05 or something. So
yeah.
like 13 or maybe 06.
06, yeah.
And outside of the
Almost
podcast, outside of the podcast, we've had some massive arguments,
Right.
I can think of four off the top of my head.
Oh, I
And
only think of 3, actually.
and there was the time in Vancouver.
Yes.
There was the time in my car as I was
Yes.
dropping you off. There was
And then there's the politics time.
there was a time in my condo.
In Seattle, yeah.
And then
think it's
there was another time early when we were at that place where Shun yelled at the
Oh, yeah, at that Mars bar.
Mars bar.
Did we get in an argument?
Yeah, or like first 6 months we knew each other or something. Like
What?
you met me there or something.
Oh, but not that night.
No,
Oh, a different night.
like around that time.
Oh, weird.
Yeah.
I don't remember that one. Do you remember what the argument was?
I don't.
Okay.
But I remember it wasn't as bad as the other three,
Yeah.
but it wasn't great.
That's surprising. Okay.
Anyway, so
But I mean, we're talking about, I used only one hand so far for all these instances.
well, but
over
for
a
most
period of-
for most people, and I contemplated, maybe you did too.
Yeah.
After some of those fights, I was like, well, I guess we're not friends anymore.
I guess so, sure.
It's like, well, we're not going to recover from that one. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I made a choice that I, loved you enough that it would completely counterbalance any
Right.
occasional issue like that. Because I kind of said to myself, well, it's like if everyone I love, I run away from when I have a problem with them, I'll be alone for the rest of my life.
That's fair.
and I just sort of weighed the pros and the cons, and it's like the fights that we had, if you really think about them, were really kind of dumb fights. They weren't like fundamental issues to our personalities.
Not fundamental, but at least one was important enough. The other ones were not important.
Which one was important?
I think the car one.
Interesting.
And it's almost not because of what it was. It was sort of a turning point in my understanding of my relationship to you and others. And it was also, I think, a turning point for our relationship.
Interesting.
But like a lot of the other stuff was...
But that one, we didn't really talk closely after that fight for a long time.
Right. That's why I'm saying that one was sort of like the harder one.
Are you saying you understand my position? It kind of sounds like you're saying that, or am I just being...
Your position from that time?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course.
Oh, okay.
But I'm also saying that like that one to me was the most, because like, okay, so like the one in your condo about politics, it's like I still would probably say the same exact things and hold my same exact positions as I did that night. And if we again got to a standstill, it would still be annoying. But that to me doesn't matter that much.
Well, that one was lesser.
Yeah. And like...
we made up on that one like an hour. I texted you like an hour later or something.
And if I'm not wrong, Vancouver was a side effect of the car.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like, okay, so those are aftershocks, right?
Okay.
And then this other one, I don't even remember, but fine.
Yeah.
So to me, the meaningful one was the whole circumstances around the car.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, we were fighting about whether Ford or Chevy was.
Yeah. It's like, what the hell?
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, to the listeners, if it gets a little heated,
We've been down hotter, baby.
yeah, understand we're in a safe zone. Everything's fine. Two, if Humberto and I are going to get in meaningful debates, there's going to be consequences sometimes. And so, if we completely avoided like the plague, any kind of disagreement that would lead to bad feelings, I think it would make a worse podcast.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to make a joke and disagree with me in that moment.
No, I'm taking this one serious.
Okay. Another 5 people didn't like it when Kirk did not get to the point. which honestly I get. I mean, like, there are times, again, I want to explain this one too. So I am positive every listener has been like, okay, Kirk, get to the point. And let me explain why it's hard for me. I am speaking a string of thoughts. Like I'm at the point now where I don't edit very much anymore, because if I spend as much time editing as I did in the past, I wouldn't be able to make as much content.
Of course.
Like in the past, I would edit. The editing process of an episode would take, I remember counting something like 10 hours for every hour I recorded.
Yeah.
Especially when I had like 5 people to edit, you know what I mean? And so that would really not be a good use of my time. So I could edit everything, and really kind of eliminate when I'm over talking, or even just pull out whole sections, which I occasionally do if I go off the rails. But I don't, mostly because I've gotten to the skill zone where I don't have to do that anymore. Yeah. In the beginning, like that just was not possible. The other thing is that if I am doing an episode, even with Humberto, I am following my notes. There's no effing way I could do an entire episode on a detailed psychological topic without having notes in front of me.
Right.
There are some topics I know so well I could, but that's pretty rare. Plus, I have notes to keep me on track.
Yeah, I'm kind of actually fascinated by that comment, because my impression is that only with a few exceptions, you usually have planned out where you're starting, where you're going. In fact, so many times I bring stuff up and you're like, in fact, we're going to talk about that. So maybe, I wonder if it's, one way to phrase it is get to the point, but another way to phrase it is like, you know what you've done recently that maybe addresses some of this? I can't speak for them directly, but you know how in some of the recent episodes you open with your thesis and then we go through? That might be different, because it didn't always used to be that way, right? We'd go through the episode, and at the end you'd be like, so in summary, I think blah. More recently you've said, here is my thesis, blah. And then we go and talk about it. Yeah. I wonder if that's part of it, because otherwise I feel like you're always well organized and leading in a certain direction.
Well, again, you're being nice.
But I mean, I'm just saying, like,
no, you're.
I listen to hundreds of hours a week of stuff online that is way less organized.
Totally, and so that's why only 5 out of 300 people mentioned this, and they weren't being jerks about it. But of the episodes so I don't listen to every episode of ours, but occasionally I will. And there are some times where I'm yelling at my phone, telling myself to get to the goddamn point.
That's fair. And maybe I'm biased.
Yeah. The other thing is that sometimes when I get into my notes, so I'm looking at my notes and I'm talking. Mm-hmm. So it's like trying to pat your tummy and rub your head at the same time or whatever.
Right.
It's hard to do, and so sometimes a sentence I'll read it, because I'm reading it subconsciously, right? I'm not like reading it out loud, and I'll see a note and I'll start kind of talking on that point,
right?
And then there'll be 10, 15, 20 more points, and then another point will come up in my notes that will be the exact thing I said above, because I thought I was supposed to say it above.
Oh,
but here it fits better. So then I repeat it. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And so because it has to be kind of free associative talk while I'm looking at notes. And sometimes I get tripped up and repeat things, and I'm sorry. 5 people said they didn't like non-psychological topics. 5 people said the podcast is too long sometimes, which I totally get. 4 people said they didn't like Tougher Bluffs. Tougher Bluffs are not liked on average by the listeners. We'll get it more.
We haven't done Tougher Bluffs in a while,
right? So even the fact that people would mention Tougher Bluffs means to me they're listening to the archive.
Yeah.
Because if you listen to episodes from 5 years ago, probably every other episode did some section of Tougher Bluffs, and some episodes that's all we did.
Yeah.
Because back then I was working much more hours. I had no time to prep for the podcast, but I wanted to release episodes. And so, you and Mandy would show up at my house and I'd be like, I guess we'll look at my list of tougher bluffs,
Right.
or we'll just make them up on the fly.
Yeah.
So, I get that you wouldn't like that. 3 people didn't like the advertisements. Sorry about that. 3 people didn't like the patron shout outs, which I find to be interesting. So if we ever do shout outs, I'm going to do it at the end. So I'm going to say, okay, we're done with the content. Now we're going to, because some people love the patron shout outs.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? 2 people didn't like announcing bad credit cards.
I had a feeling someone might not like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope people understand that I'm joking. Like, there's nothing wrong with, you have a credit card that I just lost my credit card and asked for a new one. And so I'm running into that problem where some websites are saying your credit card doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
There's nothing shameful about that. I was joking. Our humor is sometimes over the top, right?
And announce their credit score kind of bad,
right? which of course we wouldn't do, but I hope people understand that I am joking. Anyway. Someone actually emailed recently and said they were really hurt about something that I said that was along these lines. Oh, I said in a recent episode, maybe, I don't know, a month ago, I said that, so Humberto, you and I have been rambling this entire episode, or in that direction. And I said, and I know from the survey that some people didn't like it when we ramble. And to you people, I just say, suck a bag of dicks.
Yeah.
And
that you forwarded me that email. That was touching.
Right. And one person wrote a long email about how disrespected they felt because I should care more about what the listeners think.
Especially because that person described that they used to feel that way when they first started listening to the podcast because they didn't know us. And so and they made sort of a good point, right? Like, just like with anyone else in life, you don't meet someone and sometimes you might, but most often you don't meet someone and instantaneously you love or hate them or know everything about them, right? It's a process. You have to talk to them, meet them a few times. So it's similar with us. If someone discovers the podcast and immediately the episode they're listening to is some 2 random dudes sending random statements about random stuff, that could be a turnoff.
Totally. And that's why I barely ever do that.
Right. But once you get to know us, then you kind of crave that ramble. You love it.
But there is no way I want to disrespect people who don't like those episodes. You know what I mean? And but I get that some people wouldn't get that sense of humor. You know what I mean? That they would think, "Wow, Kirk, you're being pretty hostile towards people." I have zero hostility to people who don't like rambly episodes. I get it. 1, because I get it. 2, of the podcasts that I hate, I recently was looking, I'm really trying to find a good movie review podcast, just like all they do. And so I, looked online, top 10 movie review podcasts. And I subscribed to all 10 of them. I'm going to try all 10 of them and see how they do.
Hardcore.
All of them started off rambly.
Okay.
And I was like, done. Like I if I get 5 minutes, if you don't get to the point within 5 minutes of the episode, I'm unsubscribing completely. I'm not even going to give other episodes a chance.
You're harsh.
So I get it. You know what I mean?
So I listen to movie reviews on YouTube and they are by nature more to the point because they try to do shorter videos.
Right. And there's this thing that bothers me. I apologize to anyone out there who is doing this kind of podcast. There's a lot of people who listen to podcasts and they love a podcast like Joe Rogan or something.
Right.
And they're like, "Hey, me and my friends talk, so let's get some microphones and we'll be famous," and they just randomly jab into the microphone and think that it's going to be compelling content, and to me it often is not. Do you know what I mean? And so anyway, I get that, 1, and 2, mortified that anyone would think that when I said suck a bag of dicks or whatever I said,
That you meant it literally.
that I meant, well, not literally, but I meant it as a literal, like, hostile statement to people. Like, that was not my intent. And I probably should not make such quote unquote jokes to strangers. I do this at school all the time as a professor. I'm one of those professors that, says stuff like that. As I'll be in front of class and I'll just be like, I'll say something like suck a bag of dicks or something, because that's how I talk with everyone in my life.
Right.
And everyone else talks like that too.
Yeah, just daily to everyone you say to suck a bag of dicks.
Yeah. It's how I say hello. My neighbors, hey, you doing, Kirk? Yeah, suck a bag of dicks. But the problem with that is that most people don't have that sense of humor.
Right.
Or at the very least, they're not sure they might have that sense of humor, but they're like, wait, what? Like, I don't know this guy. Like, what's happening right here?
They don't realize that in your country, it's considered magic.
Yeah. And so I have a problem with that. In a similar way that I have a problem with swearing in context, that I probably shouldn't swear as often, Anyway, 2 people said they didn't like random episodes. 2 people that said they didn't like reruns. I want to explain the reruns thing just briefly. The only reason why I was posting reruns is because some of our most popular episodes had fallen off that 300
I see. You're
limit.
trying to bubble them up.
So I was trying to bump them to the front so that people would have access to these really popular episodes. I'm not interested in, posting reruns.
We should do clip shows.
Can you imagine?
Do you remember when and then we fade into... Well, that was a sticky situation.
One person said they didn't like when we bash Christianity, which I'm trying to think of a time when I don't think I bash Christianity.
Yeah, why would we bash Christians? They've been bashing themselves for 2,000 years. Ba-boom.
One person said they didn't like evolutionary psychology. One person said they didn't like the experts. One person said they didn't like the diagnose Trump with narcissistic personality disorder episode. Another person said they wanted more co-hosts. One person said there wasn't enough swag, and another person said they didn't like the professional episodes. They wanted more applicable to episodes to non-clinicians.
For more co-hosts, I could just start doing different voices, Like we could just, here's Morty.
Yeah, that's compelling content. So I asked people why they would cancel their Patreon subscription among those who were patrons. And so even though I sent this survey out to patrons, YouTube, and Facebook, something like 95% of the people who responded were patrons.
Yeah.
So I asked people why you would cancel. What do you think the most common response was?
Why they would cancel? Because they don't have the finances. They run into.
So that was number 3.
Okay.
Number 1 was no answer. Again.
Okay.
About a third was just like,
I wouldn't cancel.
I'm not going to answer.
Okay.
It's unclear what that means.
Okay.
20% said they wouldn't.
Oh.
They said,
Nice.
I can't think of a good reason to cancel.
That's crazy.
Those kinds of responses. And then the next response, 20% said finances. Yeah.
Financial hardship.
What do you think the next one was?
If we stop producing high quality content or something.
Excellent. Yeah. 17% said things like, if the topics stop being interesting to me. And then what do you think the next one was? It was a distant.
If we start doing too many movies.
No, politics.
Oh, politics, right. That was the other.
So the content, I would cancel if the content veered too much into politics and less about actual theoretical or empirical psychology. Blah, 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 blah. So, which I get.
That must have been a Russian bot.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get into host things here. When people were asked about their satisfaction with me, 91% said they were very satisfied with me, and 9% said they were somewhat satisfied with me.
So like you were somewhat satisfying.
Yeah, there was a change from 2 years ago when we did the survey that there's a lower rate of people being very satisfied with me.
Really? You had more very satisfied?
I had 96.
I mean, that's a high percentage.
And this time I had 91. Can you think of why there'd be fewer people?
You have more you have more people.
Yeah, I mean that's the statistical answer, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like
I mean, if you got a billion people, you're not going to be at 94 or 92, right?
Right. Because of a wider plurality of opinions and sentiments and dispositions. Also, as you, so what I would speculate is that I've become more random is one word I'd put to it. I've become more free, I guess, in the past 2 years, I would say. I've become progressively more opinionated in some ways.
Sure.
And I wonder if some of the things I say.
Actually, that is true. If I think back to old Kirk was more like a late night host. Hi. Oh, well, that's interesting, Mandy, but we really should move on. Like that kind of thing.
Right.
More modern Honda is more like the late night host.
Yeah, that's funny. So there's that. And people said a lot of nice things about me, which is nice. Oh, so about swearing, which I should have asked a specific question about swearing, because I actually am curious, because some people have said they like the swearing, some people said they didn't like the swearing, and on the survey it was the same thing. One person wrote, adore the F-bombs. No one mentioned the swearing, so I'm guessing that's, like in the least favorite part of the podcast.
Right.
No one mentioned swearing, so I'm guessing it's not that big of a deal. But I know there's some of you out there who don't like or want the swearing to be limited anyway, which I'm trying to do.
We're fucking trying over here.
There were some people who commented on me ranting. And for example, one person wrote, Kirk does so much research and really knows all the angles. I like that even though he often has a strong opinion or rants. He also seems to see the other side of things, even if he doesn't like it.
Yeah.
Another person wrote, I love the rants, maybe even most of all.
Oh, interesting.
That's interesting, right? Another person wrote that they canceled their Patreon subscription because it felt like there was more ranting about stuff.
Oh, so the opposite.
Yeah. So
Weird.
the ranting can go either way, it seems.
Yeah.
And then, again, people are mentioning that I was dismissing you. I didn't read those responses, so let me read them.
You dismissed them.
Kirk can be quite dismissive of Humberto, and that doesn't come across well. I agree. Kirk can be a bit dismissive of Humberto, which is fine if Berto doesn't mind. I just tend to cringe. Another wrote, I would say you can also be a little too dismissive of and patient with Humberto at times.
Everyone uses that dismissive word, so maybe there is something to it.
Yeah. And I know you stated you're aware of this, but just a friendly reminder. Okay. So Humberto, what percentage of people were very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, and below? What do you think?
110%.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to go 90%. Go for broke.
Very satisfied?
Yeah.
No, it's lower than that.
All right, then I'll go 60%.
More, higher.
Okay, 75%.
68.
68%.
So 68% were very
That's
satisfied.
much lower than your numbers.
But it's higher than 2 years ago.
Oh, well, that's an
So you went from 64 to 68.
Okay.
Which I could see, honestly.
Trending.
I feel like in the past couple of years you've definitely upped your game.
But maybe. But it's also weird because we have all the older episodes still there. So
Yeah. And 18% were somewhat satisfied.
okay.
So I have the graph in front of me. A good portion of people, say about 4 or 5%, jumped from somewhat to very over the past couple of years. So at that rate, at one point, you will be 110%. 7% were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. 6% were somewhat dissatisfied. So those 6% are those
6% is high.
Yeah. So that is up from 2% before, and a couple people said they were very dissatisfied with you.
Wow. Yeah. I've managed to basically pull down the worst in them.
Well, so here's the thing. So one, you have a shtick, right?
Polarizing.
And you can be polarizing. I don't think you're that bad, but you have opinions and you're not afraid to share them. So that's going to bother some people. The other thing is that if someone doesn't like me, they're not going to listen to this podcast anymore.
Right.
If someone doesn't like you, but they like me,
They could still skip episodes.
yeah, because a good portion of episodes you're not on.
Yeah.
So if you had a podcast that I was occasionally on,
The numbers might be different.
yeah, exactly.
I might have 40% approval.
So it's not like 68% of the world is very satisfied with you. It's like, of the people who have found, and plus it's a psychology podcast.
Yeah.
And you're not a clinician.
I mean, I have to be honest, right? Like, I would not feel like I'm doing my job, challenging ideas and doing all these things if everyone's like, yep, I like it. Now, what is, like, I would certainly take note of is if there were a lot of people, like a significant number of people that felt offended, or they felt, like
hurt
I
or
was,
something.
yeah, like I was being insensitive to classes of people out there or things like that,
Having said that, 86% said they were satisfied with you.
Right.
So that's a lot of
healthy
people.
majority.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. And when I've done satisfaction surveys my whole adult life. One of my very first jobs before I was a therapist was a researcher at a hospital at Evergreen, actually, near your place, that surveyed all the patients, and I think even the physicians, their satisfaction with the hospital. And so I've looked at a lot of, and I do all the outcomes for my program at Antioch University. I ask students, I ask teachers, I ask supervisors, I ask clients, satisfaction with everything we do. And I can tell you that 86% satisfaction is very high.
Yay!
Like that means you are doing really good. All you know what I mean? Like that's a big deal.
So the other ones can go suck a bag of dicks.
So some people, when asked what their favorite part of the podcast, they said that Humberto was their favorite part of the podcast. About 1 in 6 mentioned that so when asked about their favorite part of the podcast, about 1 in 6 mentioned their favorite aspect was you.
Nice.
So like
that's good.
The top thing.
Sure.
So one person wrote, "It also took me a while to warm up to Humberto, but now I just love him." Another person wrote,
"I'm like a tube amplifier."
Yeah. Another person wrote, "Content selection is amazing. Also Humberto, maybe mostly Humberto." They also said that they like a connection. They felt that they were connected to you. For example, one respondent wrote, "Humberto is fun and honest and open to understanding others and himself. He's not afraid to be open about his failures and shortcomings, which makes him so relatable. He's a great addition to the podcast."
This tickles my cuckolds.
Another wrote, "I love that I feel personally connected with both Kirk and Humberto, even though I have not met them IRL. I appreciate both the vulnerability and humor, which forms an attachment for me and draws me back for more. You have truly become a supportive community for me, and I often find myself thinking of concepts talked about on the podcast during therapy sessions with clients. Thank you so much for putting your heart and soul into the podcast."
That's so nice.
Another person likes your sense of humor. "I love the silly episodes with Humberto. I find I look for more and more of those to listen to." Another wrote, "I also love the Humberto episodes. He's a funny guy."
Wait, what do you mean funny? How am I funny?
Another wrote, "I like," when asked about their favorite part of the podcast, they wrote, "I like Humberto's relentless barrage of jokes, good and bad."
What bad? Come on. No respect.
Another person wrote, "I especially love all of Humberto's jobs."
What do you mean all? That's a little confusing.
Yeah, I think you just have one job, right? Yeah. Co-host chemistry, a lot of people said they love that. I won't read those. I think that's self-explanatory. Some people responded to the occasional conflict that we have. For example, one respondent wrote, "I like the way Humberto and Kirk are unafraid to disagree. Listening to disagreements can make me squeamish because I'm a little conflict avoidant, but I think the discussions between Kirk and Humberto are constructive and a good example of how to listen and understand when someone is saying even if you disagree. And I've come to find their entertainment value now that I've gotten over my initial avoidant hump." Do you want to hear the negative?
Absolutely.
Okay. When asked for their least favorite part of the least favorite part of the podcast, 5% indicated that they do not like Humberto in some way. For example, one respondent wrote, Humberto is very likable but distracting.
Oh, okay. I'll take it.
Another respondent wrote,
Squirrel.
I just personally don't like Humberto's humor.
That's fair.
Another
that is
wrote,
totally fair.
Another wrote, I find myself skipping episodes with Humberto as I find these episodes really frustrating due to the mindless dialogue between Kirk and Humberto.
Okay.
Don't get me wrong, Humberto seems like a really funny guy who would be great to meet at a party or something, but his style in this forum I just find too inane.
I'll just take this. I'll take all of these. Like, this sounds fair.
The last one, I don't care for Humberto's shtick. This is completely a personal preference and not a criticism of the podcast.
What's funny is if they met me, they'd realize how little of a shtick it is. But you know what? Those comments, like, this is a bubble for my own life, right? Like, this reflects my experience in life.
What do you mean?
You know, most people find me likable and fun at parties, and there's definitely at least a 5% that just don't connect.
And you've accepted that a long time ago.
I've accepted that a long time ago.
Okay, let's get into some demographics. The political leanings. What distribution? So I asked open-ended question. Just tell me, and I categorized into left or liberal, centrist, independent. So people, right. I'm sort of lumping in independent, centrist is kind of a weird category, but I did that. And then you got people on the right, Republican, conservative. Right. And then you got libertarian, which I'm putting in another category. And then another category is none or don't know. How many people are identify as liberal left?
I'm going to say 80%.
Close, 74%.
Okay.
Which is almost identical to 2 years ago. So we have a very similar political distribution. So that's notable, right? That,
right.
3/4 of our listeners are hard left people.
Yeah.
You know, they're not just slightly in that direction. You know, they're liberals.
They're very in that direction.
How many people on the right? How many Republicans, conservatives? And this is in other countries too, by the way. Because something like a third, which we'll get into, of the respondents were not from the U.S.
15%.
Lower.
5%.
Lower.
Oh my God. 2%.
3%.
3%.
Yeah. Which is about the same as 2 years ago.
Do you realize more percent don't like me than we have right-wing listeners?
Right. 3%.
Oh my gosh.
3%, which is interesting. You know, that's notable, right? 8% centrist or independent, 3% were libertarian, and 12% said none or don't know.
So if in IRL I meet someone and I find out they're right-leaning, maybe recommending our podcast isn't the best. Well,
so I have a couple thoughts about that. One is that conservative Republican people are probably immediately turned off by anything related to psychology because psychology is so filled with liberals.
Sure.
So there's that. The other thing is that I have a feeling like some of the listeners to the podcast are closeted Republicans and maybe identified in the podcast as being centrist or independent or even libertarian. Like I know some people who I would characterize as Republican who identify as libertarian.
Okay.
You know, and there's also there's a doubling of the none don't know category this time as 2 years ago. So I think that there's a lot of people who are like, well, I used to kind of be Republican, but I can't possibly be a Republican anymore because of Trump. And so I'm just going to say I don't know,
right?
You know, or none. I don't have a political affiliation. I don't know. It's all speculation. The other thing is that you and I are left leaning. When we looked at the different categories, technically speaking, we're at the far left.
Yeah,
and not to say that we're extremists, but that we're not complacent lefties. We're not Bill Clinton lefties.
Right.
You know, we're progressive lefties.
And that means that even though we don't try to, it comes out.
Right. It absolutely comes out in our language.
And even more, there are times, anyways, it does come out.
And so, given today's landscape, and maybe any landscape, if you're right, you're going to be like, I'm not listening to this anymore.
Yeah.
And so of the Republicans who have come across us, if they got, 20 episodes in, we probably said something that irked them on some level, you know.
Which does speak a little bit to the fact that we actually have a 3%.
Right.
That's interesting.
Right. It is interesting. And I looked at their satisfaction ratings and, you know, they love the podcast. So, you know, kudos to you. I mean, that
could also match some of the responses about like the one thing I don't like is when you get too political.
I looked at that, and I think I actually coded that, so we can look at that later. Oh yeah, so that's the next topic here is the political discussions. So I asked them actually to rate their satisfaction with political discussions. What do you think the distribution of satisfaction to not satisfaction was?
So it sounds like most people were not satisfied. So like 70% not satisfied.
No, actually, 68% were satisfied with our political talk.
Wait, actually, you're right, because it wasn't one of the top categories, right?
It was something like 5% people
right.
said.
So that wouldn't have made sense.
When I prompted them about their least favorite thing.
Yeah.
So that's like, they're like, well, I guess if I was to say something, it'd be the political thing. Yeah. So 68%, and so 41%, so 9% said they didn't care. So I don't know what that means exactly. It's just like, I don't care. Yeah. But 41% said they were very satisfied, and 27% said they were somewhat satisfied. 11% said they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied.
Okay.
And 11% said they were somewhat dissatisfied, and only 1% said they were very dissatisfied.
Okay. All right.
So one way to put this is 12% are dissatisfied, which is interesting. I mean, that's a much higher dissatisfaction rate than a lot of other aspects of the podcast. So it's like there's this balance of just like, well, what gain do we get by going into political topics? But here's the thing, Berto, let me ask you. When I ask this question, like, rate your satisfaction with political discussions on this podcast, I did not give an example. I didn't say, for example, when we discussed A, B, or C. So after, you know, reviewing the data, I was thinking, what was in their mind?
Yeah, what does it mean to be very dissatisfied? It could be that we don't talk enough about politics. Or when we do, we only brush the subject. We don't go deep.
That's a good point. I was assuming, based on the qualitative responses, that they just don't like it when we talk about politics.
And I would say you're probably right based on those verbatims.
Right. And some people were saying that it's not that they disagree with us. In fact, some people were like, I agree with you. But the problem is, I just don't want that in my life. You know, if I'm going to search that out, I'm going to seek it out. But when I come to you guys,
it's to escape some of that.
Yeah, I want to escape that place, you know? And I totally get that. And I feel like I've succeeded, you know, to some extent, because there are so many, I have to tell listeners, there are so many times when, to a lesser extent me, but more my co-hosts. You know?
Like me. No, I was going to say, like, I don't know if it might not be evident out there, but not so much anymore because you and I really do have a fairly consistent rhythm nowadays. But for a long time, I would come to the podcast ready to like rail about some latest politics thing that I was upset about or listening to. And you actually kind of like quelched that down. And at first I was always like, oh, why can't we talk about this? But I don't know if you had that instinct or whatever, but I remember you sort of explicitly saying like, I just don't want the podcast to be about politics or something like that.
Yeah. And I remember one of the very first semi-conflicts, it wasn't really a conflict, but sort of like disagreements about what the podcast was within the first couple of months. I remember you came 10 years ago and you're just like, we should talk about this or that. And I was just like, oh, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't tell you that's off mission. You know what I mean? Like we can't go there. And you're like, well, why? You know? And I remember just being like, because I don't want to alienate half of our listeners.
I remember that.
Yeah. And, so, you know, I get that.
And in my mind, we didn't really have a well-defined charter yet, right? So I'm like, I don't know, we're talking about stuff that matters. And it's interesting because the more I think about the things that people value, a lot of it has to do with like, oh, those personal stories or the compassion or talking. And I'm sure, although they didn't explicitly list it, I'm sure a lot of those episodes where we go through a topic and maybe even I have a reversal of thinking about it or things like that, that's probably valuable stuff. But if we were just kind of railing against a political topic, or even, and maybe this is sort of what they don't like sometimes about movies, is that when we're like railing with very opinionated opinions about stuff, that's ultimately not as relatable or as impactful to their growth. And so the people that like it, they like it. In fact, a lot of them seem to love it. But for some people, it doesn't seem to work as well.
Yeah. So people out there, if you're dissatisfied with political discussions, please email me. You can do so anonymously by going to anonymously. You can do so anonymously by going to the website and filling out the form. I want to know what you were referring to when you were saying you didn't like the political discussions, because I made an episode like, is Trump narcissistic, for example?
Yeah.
I guess you could call that political, but it's about an individual. I never go into his politics on that episode. I can't think of a time where we directly talked about like Democrats and Republicans, you know? I mean, there are, I guess, if anything, you're the one that brings it up.
Yeah,
like,
I bring it up.
You're the one that's like, well, Republicans lack empathy. I mean, you literally said that one time, and I was like, had a big problem with that statement. So, I wonder if is it stuff like that, or I was actually asking Mike Drain about this, and he was like, well, maybe it's things that are considered political.
I see.
Like if we talk about global warming, like I don't consider global warming to be a political topic. That's a scientific reality.
Sadly, in this country, it is.
But to some people, they're like, oh, global warming, that's a liberal topic. Or, I don't know, if that's what they're referring to. So please, I'd like to know, because there are topics that like global warming, for example, I consider it an important thing to occasionally talk about, you know? You'll bring up veganism or something, and like the treatment of animals. Some people are people talking
political,
about are people talking about that as a quote unquote political topic? I don't know. So I asked for qualitative responses about our political discussions, and 84% of people gave a positive response to the open-ended question.
Okay.
And 16% gave a negative. The other thing to point out before I forget is that when I asked people for their favorite thing about the podcast, no one mentioned politics.
Sure.
That says something.
Sure.
No one said like, my favorite thing about podcast is when you talk about politics.
Right.
And 5% or something said their least favorite thing was politics. So that, it kind of says something. It's like, how much gain are we getting as opposed to how much, Having said that, sometimes it's just impossible not to like mention something. Anyway, so when I asked people to provide qualitative, open-ended response to discussion about politics, 42% didn't answer the question at all. So that could indicate apathy or approval or something. Because typically, if you have a negative thing to say when you're given the opportunity, you're going to say something. And then a lot of respondents gave positive responses, like, completely agree with everything you say. Another respondent wrote, even if I disagree, I never feel attacked or threatened, which I find to be
Are you threatening me?
Yeah, very good to hear. Because it's like, because I always assume there are people out there that disagree with me, especially when it comes to political topics, and I try to speak to them as if they were sitting right in front of me. You know what I mean? Another person wrote, I like how Kirk isn't afraid to express his political beliefs, but also encourages empathy for and understanding of other viewpoints, which is music to my ears, honestly. Another group of people said they wanted more. Someone said, don't shy away from it. Another person wrote, enjoy them very much, would like more.
Interesting.
Another person wrote, the world needs more of this. Another person wrote that their least part of the podcast was when Dr. Kirk shies away from expressing an opinion or controversial topics like politics. So some people are annoyed that I don't talk about it more,
right?
Which I've actually heard from people. They're just like, and co-hosts, honestly, they'll just be like, why are you shying away from that? I'm just like, because I don't want to make this podcast into that, And there are a number of people who are neutral. Like one person said, don't care since I mostly agree with you anyway. Another person said, I don't mind it,
Well, one other way to think about it, although it goes against the fact that we do so much pop stuff, like pop movies and pop music and stuff, But if you think about listening to this podcast 10 years from now, which, I mean, you'd be lucky, but great. Things that we might be talking about that are like current political topics may not be as relevant anymore.
Totally. Like, I have I don't know if you were there. I don't think you were. I have a couple episodes about coping with Trump being elected.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if people remember this, but soon after Trump was elected, for a lot of liberals, I think particularly for women, around me anyway, were actually being triggered into PTSD symptoms.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because it felt as though America was no longer a safe place, especially regarding sexual assault. And this is before Me Too, you know? And
I know from my side, like I have friends that are not white that have literally said that they're very seriously considering moving out of the country.
Right. And yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, there were Hispanics who were afraid just because they were brown that they were going to get booted out of the country. Yeah. And some people did. So so there's an episode, 2 years ago where I'm like compassionately talking to liberals saying, we can get through this. Let's try to come together. Let's not overreact. I get your feelings. 10 years from now, it's going to be like some really weird episode. Negative feedback.
By the way, is it always important to come together? Or can like you come first, but the other person still comes and it's fine?
Come together right now.
Okay.
Over
whom? Someone.
Negative feedback. So I actually, because they identified where they were in a different question in terms of the spectrum, I actually wrote it down. So a central right person, so this is someone leaning towards the right, says about political topics, don't care for it, not American, and generally lean right. So that was actually kind of a theme. Is that, we have about a third or a quarter of our listeners don't live in the States.
Right.
So they're just like, I don't care about this or that, Another person who said they were probably liberal, which indicates some kind of like, well, I don't know, maybe I'm liberal.
Yeah.
I'm dissatisfied with the political talk because as a European, I don't care that much about what's going on in the U.S. A progressive person said, I agree with you politically, but there are already too many places with political discussions.
Right.
A liberal person said, not my favorite topic when seeking out a psychology podcast. Another liberal person said, please stop. Everyone talks about politics. I need an escape from it. Love you guys. And a Democrat wrote, probably best to stay away from politics. I am a left-wing liberal, but I can imagine conservative listeners feeling a bit misunderstood at times. So if you're one of those people, or if you're someone who can identify, please let us know what you have heard in the podcast that has made you feel misunderstood or disrespected or something, because I'm curious about that. Because there's two possibilities that I could imagine happening. One is that we've both said something or things that have been hurtful or bothersome. The other possibility is that I have never said anything that have perturbed people, because I really try to watch that. And my co-host, because I didn't ask like, give feedback about Kirk's discussion. Give feedback. Right. They just lumped it all together, because you've definitely said hurtful things about people on the right. We identified one thing, and you're okay with that, and I'm okay with that, because I feel like you're actually representing a voice of people that is prominent, and so I want to have that dialogue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I want to engage in that, and so if it's that, then I'm like, well, I kind of like that, I kind of like it, because there are sometimes when you actually say what I would say to be sexist statements sometimes. And I want that represented voice, because there are listeners out there that are probably thinking those thoughts, and I want them to hear what I have to say to that.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like
I recently got an email from one of our listeners whom I had gotten into a back and forth on Facebook about our episode about the car scene in 8th grade.
Yeah.
And so it's like several conversations deep now, because we had the episode. I said some things that triggered some people, one of those people wrote strong words on Facebook, not like directly about me, but certainly about what I had said. And then, I replied, and then I think Lyndon also, like we went back and forth a few times. But then I got an email from this person, and it was a really nice email, and it was sort of like almost apologetic, like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to like fly off the handle or something. And I wrote back, I'm like, that's right, no, just kidding. I was like, well, no, like that was totally fine. It was great, in fact, because I like having the back and forth, but the point is that I wouldn't have said anything differently, because I mean, that was my perspective. And sometimes I change my mind based on our discussions and stuff like that, but I'm proud of the process.
Right.
Yeah.
When I do episodes on my own, there are sometimes when I am in a section of the talk, and I'm like, man, this is getting so boring. Yeah. And if Humberto were here, he would say something that would trigger an interesting conversation.
Right.
Or I'm talking and I'm thinking it's boring because I'm saying things that I agree with. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just talking as if it's truth, right? I'm just like da 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 da. But when you're here, sometimes you'd be like, well, wait a second, I feel like maybe this. And then either that helps me to clarify my position, or it's like, oh yeah, there is that voice out there, Right. Anyway, I asked people about their satisfaction regarding and their methods of listening to the podcast. Most people listen on their phone app. So like 2/3 to 3/4 of people listen to the podcast on their phone. Yeah. But the next category is Patreon. About 40% of our listeners listen to episodes on Patreon, either on the website or on the Patreon app on their phone.
Wow.
Which I find to be, when I started Patreon, I only wanted it to be a place where people could become patrons, and then I would give them access to episodes in another place.
Yeah.
And then at some point, maybe even Lyndon, he was just like, it'd be easier if you actually just uploaded the episodes to Patreon itself.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll do that, but who would listen on Patreon? That app it's not set up for that.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay. It was the same thing with YouTube. Like, one of my students was actually telling me, you should probably post them on YouTube because it's easier to fast forward and pause on YouTube than it is on other kinds of things. And I was like, who listens to podcasts on YouTube?
That's why I was saying, by the way, how they could solve this. Like, they're well positioned.
Yeah.
They have a lot of the tools already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Netflix could solve the problem, or Spotify. I mean, anyone can solve the problem, but no one is. But anyway, so I'm a bit perplexed and worried about all you people who are listening on Patreon. If Patreon is great if you listen to the most recent episode that's released. It's probably doable for that. But as far as like archive or other kinds of things, I don't think Patreon is where you want to go. And then 16% access premium episodes on our website, which is great because it's like, I thought it'd be lower than that because
But that's where you can get everything.
But I wish more people would use the website.
Yeah.
That's one of the things if you're listening out there, as of right now anyway, in early 2019, if you're looking for an archived episode, the best place to go is the website. I've recently completely reorganized the website. I've made these different episode groups, and so it makes it easier to find. Plus, there are 2 pages called Patreon Eps, Patreon Eps, where all the deep dives that are only available to patrons are on there. So any episodes that is exclusive to patrons are listed on the website in on just 2 pages, and you just use the universal password to get in there. So if you're looking for an archived episode, that's your best bet. Because if you're scrolling down on Patreon, one, that sucks. 2, it might not even be there, because not every episode is on Patreon.
Right. That's one possibility. We should think about it, but you could almost imagine making an app that's just a container for the website plus maybe some extras or something.
You're thinking out loud.
Sorry.
For the app?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anything about that sort of. You know a lot more about phone apps, so I kind of depend on you for that. When asked about premium access satisfaction, 81% said they were satisfied with access to premium episodes, which is great because I get emails every day like I can't access, but there's a vast sea of people out there that are just like, it's fine. When I asked for feedback regarding it, a lot of people were like, no, it's easy, it's fine. And then other people said they had problems, which we talked about before. Some people are saying when they listen on Patreon, it pauses randomly, which I have to say that would suck, and just don't use Patreon, honestly. There's so many other places you can use. Again, most people said they weren't using the podcast. So we've talked about that. How do you think people discover the podcast?
Searches on Google.
That's number 3.
Really? That's surprising. Okay, through their program. Someone at the university or something.
Oh, no.
No?
I don't know. The word of mouth? Is that what you're saying?
The program, I meant their educational program. Like, no?
No, I don't even think anyone said that.
So what did you think I meant by the program?
I won't say because that's number 1.
All right. Well, then, number 1?
Yeah.
Okay. It's promoted on Patreon.
Nope. They search on their podcast app.
Oh, okay.
So they
search for psychology.
Right. They're on their, or psychodynamic or something. They're on their podcast app.
As opposed to just searching.
Because you listen, you're mainly a YouTube guy.
I'm a YouTube guy.
Yeah. So I'm a podcast app guy.
Yeah.
And when I search for a movie podcast, sometimes I just...
That makes sense. That's why I didn't even think about it.
Right. The next is YouTube search.
Okay.
That
makes sense.
Which is way up from 2 years ago, because I think YouTube has really hit its stride in the last few years.
Right.
So 38% found the podcast through a podcast app search. 29% found it through YouTube, which is almost as much as the podcast app. 15% was a Google search. 10% was word of mouth, and 8% was other. And the interesting thing about it is that, the Google searches and the YouTube searches. So the podcast app searches were almost entirely psychology.
Yeah.
They just type in psychology in their podcast app. But when it comes to YouTube and Google, people found us through the most weirdest ways. Like, I'm just going to read all of the, keywords that people typed in to discover us.
Okay.
Amanda Knox.
Wait. Oh, okay.
Because I did an episode on that. Bowen, Charles Manson, countertransference.
This helps us, right? It helps us that we have so many.
Right. Which is interesting, because I would never have uploaded them to YouTube. And most podcasts don't upload their episodes to YouTube, as far as I know. Or maybe they do. I don't know.
Some of them do. But what some of them do, like Joe Rogan, is his is a podcast format.
Yeah.
Yet he still installs a camera, and all the camera is.
But someone has to edit that goddamn camera feed. You know that, right?
Barely, dude.
But they still have to edit it.
But I'd say like 90% of it is Joe Rogan, his guest.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan. So there's like 2 feeds, right? And yes, they go back and forth.
That would add probably.
I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying that's the only content in that podcast. And honestly, people like me, I don't even watch it. I just like set it aside and I'm just listening.
Yeah, which is, now I will say that Joe Rogan has, some of the biggest names in the world.
Course.
And so people want to see their faces, you know what I mean? Whereas with us, plus to me, honestly, I want to relax when I'm podcasting. And if I have a camera shoved in my face, it's much less relaxing.
I'll be winking at it the whole time.
Yeah. How to Meet Women, Incel, Narcissism, O.J. Simpson, Personality Disorders, Taxi Driver, Sex Offending, Systems, Therapy, Theories, Chris Cornell.
See, so it helps us to do pop stuff.
Right. So I think, that's one of the things. It's like, because some people are like, well, I'm not really interested in the pop, pop culture stuff. And it's like, totally get that. And at the same time, it helps us if we do it occasionally because it's the gateway drug. What do you think the median length of listenership was for the
median length, as in how long they've been a listener?
Listener, yeah.
Okay, Median is 6 months.
2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Half of our people are 2 years?
Yeah. On the survey 2 years ago, the respondents were newer to the podcast. So there's been a shift,
Yeah.
which makes sense because we've been making, so the podcast became much higher quality when Patreon started 3 years ago. So, 50% of people were 0 to 1 years. 40% were 2 to 3 years, and 12% were 4+ years.
Wow, 4+ years.
Yeah, I think there was one person that was like since the beginning.
10 years.
Yeah, but it's interesting.
Is that your mom?
Yeah, probably. Actually, probably is. When asked to provide all the context in which they listen, where do you think they are when they're actually listening to the podcast?
Oh, okay. They're commuting.
That's number one. Great. 74%.
Exercising.
That is number 3 at 48%.
Okay, then if not commuting and exercising, in some sort of library because they're a student.
Nope. That's not even on the list. Well, at computer at 26%, but that doesn't really count.
So what was number 2?
Doing chores.
Oh, sure. Okay. That makes
71%. 33% while working, which I find to be interesting. 29% before falling asleep.
Actually, no. This podcast would be great for work. Well, depending on what kind of work you do, because it's not the kind of podcast. First of all, you don't have to look at the screen, right? Second, it is conversational, right? So it's not the kind of thing where you have to. Well, maybe some of the deep dives you have to pay closer attention. But I think a lot of our episodes would lend themselves well if you doze off a little bit, you're fine.
5% said they just sit down and listen to the podcast.
Okay.
Which I find to be...
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I've never done... Like, I listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
I think I've told, people this before. My podcast app keeps track of all the hours I spend listening on it.
Right.
And in 2016, I found out that I spent a third of my life, listening to podcasts, meaning that a third of my life I sleep, and another third I listen to podcasts, and another third I'm not listening to podcasts, because I'm driving, I'm doing chores.
Yeah. So it'd be impossible for you to get that with just sitting and listening.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to be doing something else.
It's very similar with me on YouTube. It's like if you looked at my hours, which I haven't, that's scary, the amount of hours. But I don't sit there and just do it. I'm doing a lot of other things.
Right. And then 2% in the bathroom.
Yep, that makes sense.
Let's see. So skipping down here, 92% said they were satisfied with episode topics. That's a great stat there,
Yeah.
And very few people were dissatisfied, and only one person was very dissatisfied. Most respondents, 73%, indicated they preferred the current mix between solo me episodes and episodes with co-hosts like Humberto. Some people wanted more solo me, and some people wanted more co-hosts. But the vast majority were like, I like the current mix.
Okay.
Skipping down here. Favorite type of episode? What do you think, Berto?
Let's see. The favorite, I think we already said, was a deep dive.
Yeah, so 37%. What's number 2?
Number 2 would be a, not movie, but it would be music.
Music? No.
Like, when we, Beatles.
That's not even on the list.
Really? That's sad.
We barely ever do that, one.
Well, we do well, fine. Okay, so then.
I mean, right now you're trying to intuit my categorizations too.
Yeah. Okay, but anyway, so first was deep dives. Second would be, well, then I'm gonna say movies.
That is 5, number 5. But that's only 3% of people indicated movies.
Celebrity.
Public figures is 4%.
Okay.
And Humberto episodes are 8%.
Okay.
But number 2 is clinical episodes.
Oh, what's the difference between a clinical episode and a deep dive?
They had specifically said, because, most of our clinical episodes are not deep dives. You know what I mean? Like when we do the psychology of John.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Of John Lennon, that's a kind of a clinical episode, but anyway. So therapy theories, personality disorders, clinical talk, disorders, treatment, case studies, that kind of stuff. So number 1 is deep dives. Number 2 is clinical. Number 3 was Humberto episodes, for example. Episodes with Humberto that contain serious topics.
Nice.
They like those ones. Another person wrote, my favorite type of episodes are bantering with Humberto. Another person wrote, my favorite type of episode, I like the dynamic of you explaining complicated theory ideas to Humberto and him dicking about.
Talk to me like I'm a 4-year-old.
Well, but I just love this. It must be a non-American, right? Like,
oh yeah, dicking about is non-American.
Yeah. Another person wrote, Humberto is like a smarter version of the audience and will often say things we're thinking of, and then you're able to educate us all.
Nice.
And then the last category was emails. A lot of people like it when I respond to emails. So that is that. Favorite episode. I asked people to actually identify a favorite episode.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was that most people were the only one who identified that episode.
Oh, so it was a flat curve.
Very flat curve. I mean, a lot of people like the narcissistic episode, and then a number of people. The next category was people just said, "I like all of them. They're all my favorite." And then suicide was the next one, and that's kind of a product, I'm guessing, of the most recent deep dives I did that were significant, were narcissism and suicide. And then it's just like, very flat. You got borderline, psychodynamic theory, projective identification.
That is a very good stat if you think about it, because so many channels, so much content, you'll have like 1 or 2 episodes where people are like, oh, I like that. The rest is okay. Or even series, you watch series and you're like, well, I like the first season, but the rest is like, okay. This tells us that there's something out there for everyone.
Yeah. I guess that's one way of looking at it.
Or that we don't have anything that's great.
Exactly. Least favorite episode. What do you think? The
least of all of them?
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't even know. I mean, I don't even know enough of our old catalog, but I'll say music therapy.
No. So the most common response, so about 2/3 didn't respond at all.
Okay.
So that's a good indication.
Yeah.
Just like, I can't really think of it. And then 19% actually wrote something along the lines of can't think of one.
Okay. That's great.
But when people identified, so 5% of people identified Star Wars episodes.
No. That sucks.
Yeah.
Because we still got to do episode 9.
Right. Which, so one of the actually revelations I had in reading the data was that, it does make sense that people would be like, why are you talking about Star Wars so often? Because, when episode 7 came out and then episode 8, and then I think we might even did an episode.
We did a Han Solo.
A Han Solo episode,
one.
Yeah. It's like, it's a pretty narrow audience that we're appealing to, because, not everyone likes Star Wars.
But it must be a demographic thing.
And even people who do like Star Wars, they're not necessarily wanting to come to this podcast because those episodes, we're just nerding out.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's one thing that I've learned. It's like, it's one thing to review a movie like Bird Box and talk about the psychology. It's another thing for you and I just to nerd out on an episode. That's a very narrow group of people who haven't sought us out for that. Do you know what I mean?
But that's like us doing D&D episodes.
Well, so that's another issue, you know what I mean? But again, I'm on one hand, I'm like, okay, maybe we should redirect. But on the other hand, it's like, again, I put out 3 episodes a week.
Yeah, it's such a minority of episodes.
So, but it is interesting. And then the next so you got Star Wars at 5% of people saying, my least favorite episode has something to do with Star Wars. Then 4% had something to do with a movie.
Ooh, okay.
So there's a good amount of people that are just like, I don't like Star Wars. I don't like the movie episodes.
Yeah.
Now there's another group of people that are like, love the Star Wars, love the movies, love the movie episodes. Like we did an episode an entire episode on whether or not Jar Jar Binks was a Sith.
Yeah, I know.
Was a Sith Lord
with guests from a different country entirely.
April, and I get it. If I was listening to a podcast and they decided to talk about English soccer, for example, you know what I mean? It's akin to that.
Sure.
Like there are some people who are massive, like Paul Maynard's massively into English soccer.
Oh, is he?
Oh yeah, he loves the English soccer teams.
Okay.
The Manchester.
Isn't it called Quidditch over there, or is that cricket?
Yeah, it's cricket Quidditch. Yeah, and that I'm sure a percentage of people who would love us to talk about English soccer.
Oh man.
But if I was listening to a podcast and they had like, I don't know, 1 out of every 40 episodes was about English soccer, I'd be like, okay, why are you talking about that? And that's why I think they identified, that there. I asked people to tell me whether or not they wanted same frequency, less often, or more often on a number of different topic areas. And people, long story short, they really want a lot of clinical stuff.
Yeah. And
they want less of Star Wars. That's the most, clearly it's like less often than Star Wars, please.
But that's so unoften.
Yeah. But again,
I'm going to do a spin-off channel just about Star Wars deep dives.
Yeah. That's the other gestalt is Berto has a lot of ideas about spin-off channels that he'll never create. I asked people why they skip any episodes, like, do you ever skip any? Why? And most people are just like, well, I just wasn't interested in the topic. And then the next one, 21% said they skip if it's about movies, or some of the movies they'll skip.
Yeah. So
that's interesting. Again, I didn't know that. I didn't know that the movie thing was bothersome to some people.
Sure.
It's interesting. Skipping down. Let's see. People don't care about Twitter. I found out. People like Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram. It seems like
Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Yeah, they're not in there's. So it was Patreon, Facebook, Instagram, and then a distant to the next group is Reddit, Twitter, Pinterest, Tumblr, and Discord. So there's that.
Maybe I should start an Instagram account.
A lot of people are interested in live events, and so I actually asked people what they would want if they, when they become a patron, they get certain benefits.
Yeah.
And as an example, I said, what about a unique thing, like Humberto draws something for you?
Yeah.
And so some people were like, a quote or job description of the day from Humberto.
Oh.
Another person wrote, a drawing from Humberto. That'd be hilarious. I'd be into that.
I'll make a drawing for patrons.
Yeah. So we can do that.
Like what? I make one and we send it to them?
Yeah, maybe, or we draw it from a thing or something. I don't know. People like our Patreon goals. Like, so the top, I said, what kind of Patreon goals do you like to have? And they're like, the scholarship was the most popular thing. That might just be a function of it's the most recent thing, but I'm really glad people took that because I really kind of pulled that one out of my ass and was like, because no other podcast does scholarships for their patrons, and
we're the best. We're the best at scholarships.
And so I was pleased to find that people really liked that one. And then the next one was animal charity, which again, we've been doing with Pet Finder. Average age, median age of our response. What do you think?
Ah, man, I'm going to go 30.
34.
34. Okay, so we appeal older.
So how many millennials? So these people are 13 to 32. What percentage of our listeners are millennials? Under 32, under 33.
Yeah, I'm going to go 25%.
46%.
46%. Yeah.
So half of our listeners are probably in their 20s.
That's why they don't like Star Wars.
Maybe it could be, honestly.
Get a job.
What does that mean? Percentage of Gen X's. That's you and me, Berto.
Oh man. Well, I'm gonna go 35% then.
44%.
Okay.
And so baby boomers are 10%.
Okay.
Baby boomers 52 and up. So
okay, so it's pretty even between our gen and the youngins.
Yeah, exactly. With most people in their 20s and 30s.
All right. Well, how many people under 25?
I'd have to look at the data on that, but probably like 15%.
How many people in high school?
Very few, like one or two.
I wonder if high schoolers listen to podcasts at all.
Yeah, like 1 or 2% of our listeners are in high school. What about gender?
Okay, I'm going to go 60-40.
Well, it includes queer, trans,
sorry, I'm so uninclusive. I'm going to go,
So pick cis female first. What percentage?
Okay, fine. 55.
71.
71?
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
22% cis male.
That's a crazy divide.
And 7% queer, trans, non-binary.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So, and that's similar it's similar to 2 years ago. Actually, there's more cis females now compared to there's less males. We have the same rate, with similar rate of queer people, but we have 8% less men and about 8% more women. But this is reflective of therapists. So it's almost identical to the distribution.
Okay, so the subject matter self-selects a little bit here.
Right. 68% of people in my field are women.
Wow.
And then when I looked at podcasts, though, because I looked at podcast data regarding gender, most are men. 55% are cis male.
That's interesting. So we've also sort of found a niche where there's not probably as much content for more like female type people.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. Yeah. What about ethnicity? How many percentage Caucasian?
Oh, that's interesting. We have a lot of worldwide. So I'm going to go 45%.
79%.
Really?
Yeah.
That's not very diverse.
No.
It's not diverse I've ever seen, but it's still not great.
I mean, one factor is that of our foreign listeners, the vast majority of them are white. Okay. They live in Scandinavia. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's one
70,
thing.
Oh my God.
But yeah.
That's a lot of percentage.
10% multiracial, 5% Hispanic, 6% Asian, and 1% African American. 1%. Yeah.
That hurts.
Yeah.
Wait, what was the Hispanic ratio?
5.
Man, where's all my hermanos y hermanas?
So now this is reflective of therapists, though. We actually are more diverse than my field is.
Oh.
So my field is 84% white.
Okay.
So
wow.
Yeah. But and then among podcast listeners, 63% are white. So we're sort of like in between therapy and podcast listeners, which makes sense, But yeah,
I mean, so it makes sense based on the category,
right?
But I wish we could, eat into the other markets.
Yeah. So the very typical listener is like a 30-year-old cis female Caucasian who is a liberal living in the United States.
Right.
Which actually is reflective of our live shows, if you think about it.
Yeah, that's true.
So what about location? What percentage lives in the United States?
Oh, okay. So I'll say 70% United States.
Good, 72%. And then I lumped people into other English-speaking countries, which is 15%. 5% Germany, which is surprising.
Yeah, that's good.
5% from a Scandinavian country, and then 3% other. Of those who indicated they live in the United States, 20% live in Washington State. So,
which makes sense given the name.
Well, not to me, but I guess, right?
I mean, psychology in Seattle.
So. But to me, it's like it's more a psychology podcast than a Seattle podcast.
That is true. It started off different. That is so funny. I hadn't even realized that it's been a long time since we've Seattleified.
That was topics. Only, the first 6 months.
Yeah.
We would sprinkle, and even then it wasn't very frequent. But yeah,
so now it's more like Sleepless in Seattle.
Well, I'm a bit perplexed by this because, I mean, it makes sense that there would be a bump in Seattle and Washington because people I know, for example, were, Antioch students.
Yeah.
Most of them catch wind of the podcast and, they're going to be interested. It's like, oh, a professor has a podcast, so I'll listen to that. So there's going to be a bump there, which makes some sense. But we also have 17% live in California. But New York, for example, which has millions of people, is very low. So it's actually kind of interesting. Like by region, 50% of the, so 70 something percent are in the United States. And of those, 50% are on the West Coast or in the West states, West region. 24% are in the South, which you wouldn't think would be the next category.
Yeah.
14% are in the Midwest, Chicago. And then only 12% are in the Northeast.
That's incredible. Because there's so much there, like in terms of people, in terms of psychology and therapy. And
right. Yeah, it's weird.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't get that. The only thing I can think of is that some people will come across the podcast, will be called Psychology in Seattle, and they're turned off by it.
I don't like Starbucks.
Yeah, it makes me regret having called it Psychology in Seattle.
I don't like grunge music.
I mean, I'm not going to change the name, but it's like...
I'm going to make a spin-off channel that's just Psychology Worldwide.
We're running out of time.
Maybe I could do Flat Earth Psychology.
Oh, yeah. Psychology on the Flat Earth. Our listeners are, on average, way more educated. Psychology in Seattle listeners are about 5 times more likely to have a graduate degree, for example.
Than an average podcast listener?
Right. So 52% of our listeners have or are getting a graduate degree.
Nice.
Half of our listeners.
That's crazy.
That is, and 10% of the general population of the United States have a graduate degree.
But it makes sense. Yeah. It's like...
It's interesting,
out
though,
this topic,
Yeah. Median income, what do you think for our respondents here?
I don't know, 80K or something.
50.
50K, okay.
Which is about 20 above the U.S. median income.
Really?
Yeah.
The median income is 30?
Yeah.
Holy crap.
For an individual.
How can anyone survive?
Yeah, really. Because there's a lot of young people, you're including like 19-year-olds and stuff. But anyway, so the biggest sort of category is like 30 to 60 is the general. Most people are not in a relationship. 55% are not in a relationship.
Okay.
Which is about the same as the general population.
That's interesting.
Sexual orientation, what percentage heterosexual?
Well, it sounded like 71 plus. It was like 95% or something.
Heterosexual?
I think so, because you said 71 and 4. Oh, 71. Okay, 87.
I know, 60%. So this is sexual orientation, not gender identity.
Oh my God, I'm so idiotic. We're gonna get some hate mail here. I forgot about the difference.
So 60% heterosexual, which is actually down from 69 from the last survey. 15% of our listeners identify as bisexual.
Wow.
Which is more than the general population.
Okay.
7% lesbian or gay, 7% queer, pansexual, 5% poly, and 7% ace spectrum. We have
we actually have a lot of variety when it comes to this.
Yeah, that's really great to me.
Yeah.
That's a huge diversity, area for us.
In spite of me trying to box everyone into little categories.
We have a lot of non-heterosexual people. So, the general U.S. population is about 95% identify as heterosexual. We have 60%.
And I mean, you and I are not brothers. We're not colleagues.
What do you mean? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Humberto's referring to an email that we got from a guy who was railing on us about something and was looked at our photo on our website and said, well, obviously the two of you aren't just colleagues. So, implying that Humberto and I are gay, as if that was some kind of
a slant or something,
or some kind of bolstering his point or something. 10% of our listeners have a disability. 62% identify as having a mental illness, and that's twice the rate as the general population.
Wait, what percentage?
62%.
62?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I guess a lot of us have mental illnesses.
But
that's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah. Now, that could be that they are just better at identifying themselves, because if you just ask a random person, they're like, I don't have a mental illness, but you ask our listeners. Yeah. But But obviously, if you have anxiety or depression or PTSD, you're much more likely to seek out a podcast that talks about that.
That's a good point. How many average people would say that they have a mental problem?
Right.
Unless they're literally, no, actually, oddly, if you're committed, you probably would still not say that you have a mental problem.
Well, if you're resistant. 40% are not in the field, 48% are in my field, and 12% are in some other professional field like medicine or law or something.
Or humidifiers.
So about half of our listeners are clinicians, but half are not, which is interesting.
Yeah.
That was similar to the last survey. So it's interesting. It's like half the listeners were appealing to that very clinical, work-oriented, thing. Right. Like it's a training of some kind. But there's another half of listeners that this information has nothing to do with their with their job.
That's actually very revealing. I would have imagined. In fact, a lot of times when I was answering the questions, in my mind, I'm picturing a lot more in the profession.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's like half and half.
Half and half.
Yeah. So what's the final word on this survey, bro?
It's illuminating. I'm proud to be a part of this, and I am happy that there is so much good sentiment. I'm highly disappointed that you beat me in the numbers. That's terrible.
Well, let's see if you can bring up your numbers.
I'm going to bring up my... No. Screw that. I'm going to bring down my numbers to burn this mother down, but I'm going to start sister podcasts about all the topics that people hate, and those will get the best numbers, the best.
Yeah, I designed this survey actually pretty poorly, which meant one of the problems was that it was really long for the respondents, and two, it meant there were so many open-ended questions that I asked. I had to code forever and ever and ever, and for you people out there who have written reports on research data, you understand this. It's a laborious process. It's taken me months, honestly, but throughout this process, I've read every response several times, and it just feels really good to know that you guys are out there appreciating what we're doing, because this is really hard work, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort, and it's a commitment. And there are other things we could be doing, but we're not doing those things. We're doing this thing. And I can't tell you how great it feels to be appreciated in that way. There were so many wonderful, encouraging comments, and affirming comments, and it felt really good. And Humberto, I emailed you occasional comments that I wanted you to read, and I hope you had the same experience.
I did, absolutely. Humbling, very gratifying to know that it's not all, to be honest, I wouldn't have done it for a decade if I didn't get some reward personally out of talking, what do they call it? Blabbing about... Chit-chatting about whatever. But at the same time, man, it is just so touching to know that it affects people in a positive way.
Yeah, just tremendous. I mean, I could die tomorrow and feel like I did something, for the world in my tiny little way. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Thanks for joining us out there. Please take care of yourself, because
you deserve it.